Hello friends, welcome to Pushing Cardboard 41. This episode I bring the final two interviews from San Diego. First I speak with Ananda Gupta, co-designer of Twilight Struggle and Imperial Struggle, and then an interview that is a year delayed in some ways. At the previous San Diego HISCON I'd arranged to interview Mark Herman, but he had to cancel last minute. This time it worked out. This episode's game is a bit of a twofer. The first expansion to Commands and Colors Medieval is out, so I thought it would be a good time to have a look at that complete entry in the Commands and Colors family. And of course, we'll have a bit of news, new additions to the collection, and whatever else crosses my mind this time. This episode of Pushing Cardboard is sponsored by Noble Knight Games. If there's a game you need, they've got it. They're a treasure trove of out-of-print games you'd given up hope of finding. I encourage you to try them out. And if you do try them out, please use the link found in either the newsletter or on the website. That way I'll get a little kickback and be able to feed my addiction, and then I'll tell you about it, and you can decide if it's time to feed yours. Win-win. News. Since the last time I spoke with you, I've received and read Mark Herman's book. I wholeheartedly recommend it. I'm sure I'll speak more about it and Morris Suckling's book at a later date, but if you've ever wondered what sort of things Mark is thinking about when he's designing, this book is for you. And if there's things you think he doesn't consider, this book will probably explain why as well. I'm happy to announce PushingCardboard.com is hosting its first ever guest review. Paul Chernoff has done a very detailed look at Blitz in the East from Vento Nuovo. He's also promised a follow-up piece on another title in that series. So thank you, Paul. I really appreciate the work that went into it, and I really enjoyed reading it. If anyone else out there would like to try their hand at a written review for the website, drop me a line at grant@pushingcardboard.com. I'd love to hear what you've got in mind. GMT announced that due to a late shipment being combined with another that's now arriving early, they are changing their shipping schedule for January, and there are 13 things being released all at once, which is good news for those desperately waiting for games, but bad news for those with multiple items in those two batches, as it's going to be a double whammy on the pocketbook. Speaking of the pocketbook, in GMT's December newsletter, Gene Billingsley wrote that they were going to have to raise prices due to rising component and shipping costs. So the price of games is going to go up and the price of shipping is going to go up. Except for folks down under. The slim bit of good shipping news is that GMT has found a cheaper way to ship to Australia and New Zealand. So huzzah for that. The rest of the newsletter was good news. They're planning a winter sale to move some inventory. Rebel Fury is going to have a digital version soon, so look for that on Steam. And a new game announced. Herman, Battles in the War of Breton Succession, is the next volume in the Men of Iron series. I'll be interviewing legendary designer Frank Davis as part of the Armchair Dragoons Digital Convention, ACDC. Look for that on January 18th at 6 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. 3 p.m. Pacific. Frank was a designer and developer at both SPI and Avalon Hill and is now coming back to the hobby with a series of new designs. I look forward to speaking with him. And finally, I'm announcing my first foray into hosting my own YouTube show. I've spoken about it before, and now it's going to happen. I'll try going bi-weekly for now and see how that feels. Maybe I'll cut back to once a month. Maybe I'll ramp it up to weekly. Who knows? The first edition will be Thursday, January 30th at 9 Eastern, 6 Pacific, and then every 2 weeks after that. My intention is to sometimes have a guest and sometimes just a topic that I'll explore and hopefully interact with the audience about. Perhaps I'll invite fellow gamers on to do live reviews of their favorite games. Hard to say. I'm sure it will evolve over time. What's on the table? Well, I backed a game from Trafalgar Editions out of Spain called Tactical Commander. It uses cards and counters, so you might think it's like Combat Commander, but it's not really. Where Combat Commander has a counter for each soldier and the total order of battle for each side is a squad or two, in Tactical Commander, the scale is a little higher. This is a bit confusing to me, actually, and perhaps it's just a matter of translation as the original rules are in Spanish. Each side commands a battalion of 3 companies and maybe an optional reserve company. In each company, you can place 3 elements. The rules call these elements sections, which is what Commonwealth nations call squads. But to my thinking, these companies should be composed of 3 platoons each, not 3 sections each. I don't know. Anyway, perhaps they don't intend section to mean squad. In any case, that's the way the OOB goes on the board. Rather than an array of different maps like Combat Commander, there is just a plain Jane hex map with counters to represent the terrain, totally configurable. Mostly it's just woods and hills and a few things like that. There's an initiative system to see who goes first each phase. Movement is standard hex and counter stuff, but combat is very different and totally diceless. The strength of the attacker is measured against the strength of defending terrain, and the difference is the amount of hit points the defending unit or units must lose. Where the element of chance comes in is that there are action cards. They're a separate deck from the unit cards that have the soldiers and the AFVs and whatnot on them. And these action cards, they can do things like increase your defensive value or thwart an attack entirely. And then the other mitigating factor is that each side has a limited amount of supply points. You get a few more each turn, and some cards may give you a bonus, but they are very precious. To fire any unit costs supply points. So while the diceless combat may make it seem like it's just going to be a case of who can shoot who first, the management of the supply points is just a big break on that whole thing. If your attack costs 3 supply points, for example, but after subtracting the terrain effects, you realize it's only going to do a single point of damage to your opponent, you probably won't feel like just blasting away. I've had a few questions as I learn it, as the rule book is not as clear as I would like, but I emailed the designer and he's got back to me right away, and everything eventually makes sense. I'll have to play it more before I have real coherent thoughts about it, but I do love tactical games. The only drawback for me with this one is and this might be a plus for you, who knows, the main game is based on a design your own scenario format. There's only 2 or 3 scenarios included in the game. Basically, the design your own works where they give each player a set amount of points, and they can choose cards from the unit deck to make up their unit draw pile. And then you just go from there. I'm hoping they publish more pre-made scenarios, or maybe, who knows, I'll just become a big fan of creating unit decks. Time will tell. New games to the collection. Peloponnesian War. Yep, another solo game. A real rarity for me. That's 2 now. Mark Herman got me interested when I was chatting with him, so I couldn't resist. Commands and Colors Medieval Expansion number 1, Crusades, Middle Eastern Battles. This was a P500 item that arrived, and we'll talk about it later. The Chase of the Bismarck from VUCA. I regretted not getting this when it came out, so I was really happy to buy it at my friendly local game store when I saw it on the shelf there. Unhappy King Charles. This is the new version from Phalanx. I usually don't buy a new version when the one I have is great as it is, which the GMT one is, but this one just looked too good to pass up. I'm not often drawn in by graphics and all that, but it looks pretty great. And I've heard maybe there's a couple of rule tweaks, so we'll find out. And then finally, Gettysburg, A Time for Heroes from Worthington. This one I got on the recommendation of a listener, and I'm glad I did. I've played it a couple times now. I've really enjoyed messing around with it, and I can't wait to get an actual opposed play in. It's very different from any other Gettysburg game I have. Okay, time for our first interview. This is Ananda Gupta. For many of you, Ananda Gupta is living a dream life. His day job is working on video games, and in his spare time, he designs board games. And not just any board games, but perhaps the most popular historical board game of the 21st century, Twilight Struggle, and then Imperial Struggle. So 2 of the deepest and richest gaming experiences out there. I was excited and awed in equal measure to speak with Ananda. Here's our conversation. I'm speaking to you from San Diego HISCON, and I'm happy to be with Ananda Gupta. How are you, Ananda? Ananda, thank you.
That's all right.
Sorry, I get a lot of people's names wrong.
That's okay. I'm good. It's been a great con so far.
I'm sure everybody knows this, but you're the co-designer of one of the biggest selling war games of all time, Twilight Struggle. Co-designed with Jason Matthews,
yep,
and
right.
You guys also did Imperial Struggle.
We did.
How are you a longtime war gamer, or what's your?
Yeah, I started war games quite young. I I mean, I got into the hobby through diplomacy.
Oh, yeah.
But the group that was in high school, but the group that I played with quickly branched out into things like the old Avalon Hill civilization, and then we somehow got right into Advanced Third Reich and World in Flames. So that was all very, big jump in terms of complexity and so forth.
Yeah.
We played a fair amount of those, and then when I went to college, I played. I brought a copy of the old Krieg with me from Decision. That was a lot of fun. I played a bunch of that, and then halfway through college, I was on a trip to Germany with my parents, and I saw Die Siedler von Catan in the store window. So I brought a copy of Die Siedler back to college, and my friend group and I in college probably played that 300 times.
So yeah, Settlers of Catan.
Yeah.
The through line I'm seeing from all your early gaming is it's like multiplayer games. You're playing a lot of games with 4, 5, 6 people.
Yeah.
A lot of that, right? And yet once you become a designer later, it's more two. Did you play any 2-player games in that?
Not really.
It was more a big gaming group sort of thing.
Yeah, it's more of a big group thing. I think 2-player stuff started a little bit also in college. I played Paths of Glory's prototype with Ted Racer in 1999. And Ted will be the first to tell you that his prototypes are, he's not great at the arts and crafts, and so, it was a very Ted Racer prototype, but I was utterly riveted playing Paths of Glory,
right.
And I told Ted, he's brought back World War I gaming is now a thing, right?
Yeah, totally. It had fallen off the radar. Like the previous game I can remember having any sales at all was Guns of August from about 1985.
Yeah, that's the one. That's the one that everyone thought of at the time, certainly. Yeah. And then Paths of Glory. There's actually a funny story there because this is 1999. This is at the very birth of the internet, and this I played it with Ted, and 1999 I believe was the last Avalon Con before Avalon Hill suffered its demise.
Yeah.
And so Ted had been planning to publish Paths of Glory with Avalon Hill, and the rights then went into limbo. And so what I did was I wrote a physical letter to Hasbro, sort of to dear sir, to whom it may concern kind of thing. And I said in the letter that I would be very happy if Hasbro were to publish Paths of Glory. I thought it was a great game. I thought they would do a great job with it. But should they decide that it's maybe a little outside their target market, it would be a really great thing if they could contact the designer and return the rights to him.
Yeah.
And I put this in the mail, and kind of a shot in the dark, right? I mean, what are the chances?
Yeah, Hasbro, like giant Borg
company. And then Ted reached out to me, forwarded me an email, to my Yahoo email address, right? Saying, he'd gotten a note from someone who said, "Hey, this got to me through channels. We're happy to release the rights to you." And so Ted was then able to publish it with GMT.
And thank God, because
right.
there's a lot of titles still in limbo with Hasbro, where Hasbro technically owns the rights and the games, but they're not going to produce the games. And there's games that we're just not, that we'd love to see reprinted, but just not, it's not happening.
Yeah, I guess I just kind of sort of randomly hit a bullseye there.
Yeah, totally.
Somebody had good staff.
Yeah, because you think you write a letter to Hasbro, it's like writing a letter to General Motors or something. It's
right.
It's like
right, but no, it got to the right person who had the right decision making, and so that decision making authority, and so yeah, Ted was able to get the rights back.
And so you played that prototype, you fell in love with it, and then did you start playing more 2-player games or?
Yeah, there was so around that time was when after college was when I moved down to DC for my new job, my first job out of college, and joined the George joined the George Washington University gaming group. I wasn't affiliated with the university at all, but it was an open club.
Right.
That's where I met Jason, and that group played a fair number of two-player games, and that was where Jason and I started talking about designing our own two-player game.
Well, yeah, that's a great segue, because pretty much my next question was going to be, how did you become a designer? So you meet Jason, you're playing with Jason, and you start talking about designing.
We were going to design a Spanish Civil War game.
Right. Yeah, I was going to guess that the Cold War game wasn't your first idea, that you started somewhere else.
No, we had some guidelines. Like we wanted to pick a topic that was undergamed. We wanted to pick a topic that was important, right? Like that was a consequential sort of bilateral struggle. And the Spanish Civil War seemed like a great one, and then we found out that a guy in Spain was doing one, and we were like, well, his will probably be better. So when I was at Jason's place, I saw the books on his shelf, and it kind of occurred to me that maybe he's such an accomplished, knowledgeable person about American foreign policy. I was thinking about that, and then the next time we got together, I said, what about the Cold War? And we both knew that at the time there were only two Cold War games at the time, right? There was Supremacy, which was a multiplayer game.
Yeah. And a bit of a weird one at that.
Yeah. And then, a free-for-all game where anybody can end the game with a lot of nuclear weapons.
Yeah, everybody's got nukes. Yeah.
Yeah, it was just a little strange.
It was a bit like Risk on steroids in a way.
Yeah, that's right. That's a lot of expansions. I had all the. I had a lot of the expansions.
Yeah.
And then the other one is the Victory Games Cold War, which is another multiplayer game, right? Very symmetric, right? So it kind of invents symmetry where there wasn't any in order to support multiplayer. Neither of us thought that one was particularly historically interesting.
Right.
So we thought, yeah, this is kind of undergamed, and Jason in particular was had a big head start on the historical familiarity with the time period. I needed much more ramping up, and then
in those early days, you had the two examples of the Cold War game and the Supremacy game.
Yeah.
Both. I'm not as familiar with the Victory Games one, but Supremacy, it's got a lot. It's more like kinetic warfare from a really strategic scale.
Correct.
Did you? The game you guys end up with is nothing like that at all.
Correct.
When you were first thinking of it, were you thinking of a more kinetic type of game, or were you?
There were more elements. There were more elements of kinetic warfare in it. So we had a system where you could deploy military formations, and we cut out all that. It was not
like the politics is what's totally interesting.
Yeah. We felt like one of our guiding lights in Twilight Struggle was trying to keep complicated rules on the cards and keep the core rules as simple as possible. That was what we saw as the value out of card-driven games.
Right. Yeah.
And
we'll come back to that because
sure.
But keep going. Yeah.
And at the time, and so ultimately we just thought, well, we don't want a system that's completely open-ended with respect to warfare, with respect to conventional warfare. And we certainly didn't want a game. We didn't want to make a game about waging nuclear warfare. So that suggested all of those things should go on cards.
Right. So you get more of the focus of that the game's going to be more about politics, less about kinetic warfare, but the looming threat of kinetic warfare is still there. How did I'm always fascinated by co-designs. How do you divide up the work, or how did that go? I mean, this was your first co-design, so you're figuring it out as you go. Obviously.
I mean, most of it was us just getting together over the table and kind of hashing things out. I think a lot of the mechanical innovation, like I provided a lot of the mechanical seeds. We certainly iterated on them heavily. And a lot of the solutions, a lot of what's distinctive about Twilight Struggle came about through that iteration process. For example, I mean, Twilight Struggle was unprecedented among card-driven games, and how many years of history it covers, right? And so we certainly were not short of events,
Yeah,
right?
no, yeah, of
and
course.
so the problem was more, how do we get enough events to happen, right? If we're going to have the Cold War's worth of events, the game's going to take forever. It's going to need too many turns, but we weren't seeing enough events get played, and so it was during that process where I pitched the idea that, what if I play my opponent's event, it triggers.
Yeah,
that might increase the number of events that happen.
Exactly.
And so that concept, which turned out to be, I think, one of Twilight Struggle's more influential mechanics, that was introduced as a way of simply increasing the number of events that would trigger.
I played a game last night, a card game, Arabian Struggle.
Yeah.
But they've picked up that event that if you play your own event, you can go the event or the ops.
Either or. And
but if it's the opponent, you get to decide if you do the ops before or after.
You pick the order.
They pick the order, but they get to do it.
The event's
it's just
bite
like
you,
but that was totally an innovation at that point.
Yeah, at that time, yeah. And so, but what was interesting was, in addition to solving the problem of not enough events happening, it also led to, when the first time we played it, we knew it was the right decision, because now when you pick up your cards in Twilight Struggle after we made that change, your hand is like a crisis, right, that you have to manage, and that was exactly the mentality that we wanted. We wanted you to pick up your hand and be like, how am I going to navigate through this?
Right, there's no just getting rid
puzzle.
of the bad events.
Yeah.
So you can get rid of the good events if you want, but getting rid of the bad ones is not possible.
And so it was after maybe, it only took us, I think, 3 or 4 games with that to realize we needed to add some kind of systemic safety valve for really bad event draws. And that was when we added the space race. And
which basically lets you burn off one bad event.
Yeah, lets you pitch something.
Yeah.
We thought that was appropriate because the space race was such a key axis of superpower rivalry, and so we wanted to, we really wanted to have the space race be in. And of course, the space race is a very fertile field for card events, but adding a systemic element achieved both a thematic goal and a mechanical goal. So one thing that's been interesting since Twilight Struggle came out, so there's another Cold War game out called 2 Minutes to Midnight. I think it's Plague Island Games. I don't remember the name of the publisher, but the game is fascinating. I kickstarted it when I saw that it was that it could be backed, and it's a really interesting Cold War game because it basically takes everything that Twilight Struggle emphasizes and backburners it, and takes everything that Twilight Struggle de-emphasizes and pushes it to the front. So in this game, for example, you have you explicitly develop. There's a huge tech tree. It has an explicit espionage system involving Soviet tech theft and the stealing of secrets and the protection of secrets, and the deployment of your intelligence assets. You manage your strategic arsenal, and that has an impact on the degree to which you can engage in military aggression. It's got a really cool system for how countries that were devastated in World War II or that are just poor can be invested in and repaired or otherwise brought up and made more valuable as part of your sphere, right? But fundamentally, the objective is the same, right? Which is you're trying to get the most of the world your color, right? You're trying to paint the world your color.
Yeah.
That game also distinguishes, I think, pretty cleverly between like the government and the intelligentsia or the thought leaders. So you can have a communist or an authoritarian state, but with blue cubes in it representing liberal elements. It's a really cool game. I'm not saying it's a perfect design, of course, but the way it uses cards is completely different from Twilight Struggle. There's no private hands. It's a shared deck that you just flip cards over, and that's what happens.
Right.
And some of those cards are actions for either of the superpowers, right? And it was really nice to see somebody take another crack at the Cold War with such a perfectly inverted idea of what to emphasize in the game.
That must have felt sort of like, you've got this giant hit game. You've got nothing to prove, so you've got this feeling of, let's see what anybody else can do to add, to give another perspective. That must have felt great.
Yeah. I mean, I really like playing the games that have clearly derived some degree of inspiration from Twilight Struggle, whether it's just the opponent's events trigger, right? Like Labyrinth is a good example, right? Like I really enjoy Labyrinth. I've played it many times. I've played it with the expansions, the Awakening expansion, the Forever War. And I mean, Labyrinth I think is most correctly understood as an ancestor of Coin, right? Like it's the proto Coin game. But it is also, it also uses the Twilight Struggle. It has some inspiration from Twilight Struggle mechanics. And so
and Vogel would say that for sure.
I'm sure he would. And like, I actually prefer Labyrinth to the Coin games, not just because it's 2-player, but because I find a number of common elements among the Coin games to be just not to my taste. I really enjoy playing the Descendants, whether just kind of only thinly descended or obviously taking a lot from Twilight Struggle. Those are all fun to play. I used to, when I was younger, I used to be a little worried that someone would beat me to a great idea. And now I'm just relieved that somebody else has done the work.
Yeah, right. Yeah, totally. You still get the fruits of it.
Yeah, I still get to play.
Yeah. I want to come back a little later about the thing, your idea about putting the tough stuff on the cards to keep the. But we'll get back to that. But I want to talk a little bit about where Trilix Struggle's gone. Jason did Red Sea, which is kind of a smaller thing. And I think the last time I talked to you, just like incidentally, not on mic or anything, you talked about maybe doing a new Twilight Struggle as well. Is that?
Yeah. So Jason's also working on South Asian Monsoon.
Right. Which is not it's not like Red Sea, which was like kind of like a intro game.
Right. Red Sea's only a couple turns.
Right. With the new one he's working on is more like a full blown.
It's
game.
more like half a Twilight Struggle.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think South Asian Monsoon's turn count is 5 or 6. I don't remember exactly. I've only play tested it once. And the one I've been noodling on is Twilight Struggle Liberation, which is the Cold War in Latin and South America.
Right.
And that would be more like South Asian Monsoon. That would be more of a 6-turn game, right? I'm thinking of basically 6 5-year turns. Starting in 1960 after the Castro Revolution, right? So it would be the 60s, 70s, and 80s.
What draws you to the Central South America?
Well, I think the Cold War was, the Cold War was particularly bloody in that area of the world, and I think one of the things that I think I've learned just from looking at Jason's design work on South Asian Monsoon and Red Sea is how differently the Cold War was experienced for all the different regions, which is pretty abstract in the original game, right? And Liberation, I think, Liberation needs to lean into that because the Cold War was experienced in a very unique way in Latin America and South America, and capturing that is a really cool design challenge. That's also very hard. Well, and it's hard because it's hard for a variety of reasons, but counterinsurgency was such a major theme during that period, and there's already coin games, and so part of what I have to think about while working on Liberation is to what degree do I borrow from Coin or Labyrinth, and to what degree is that appropriate, and to what degree can this game still be an influence placing area majority game like Twilight Struggle, right? Because I think one of the things we learn with Imperial Struggle is that people, if they see Twilight Struggle on the box, I think they have some expectations, and I don't want to deviate too far from those. But on the other hand, the game has to do justice to the historical narrative and the historical facts, and so forth, and so
it's got to be Twilight Struggle-y,
yeah,
but it's still got to be its own thing because
we called Imperial Struggle the spiritual successor to Twilight Struggle, hoping that people would understand that meant the mechanics were going to be pretty different.
Right.
It's a spiritual successor in that it is likewise a global struggle between two great adversaries that mattered a lot, right? And that was why we called Imperial Struggle the spiritual successor to Twilight Struggle. But it turns out that when people saw Jason and me designing it, and it was a 2-player game, they were kind of expecting something more like Twilight Struggle. I think a lot of them were pleasantly surprised, because I think the game is very good.
Yeah, me too.
But it certainly was. I think we had a number of people who thought this is not what it said on the tin.
Right. Yeah. I suppose. When you open that map, I think that it's just like, oh, it's obviously not Twilight Struggle, but it's obviously like wildly interesting. Like, and the thing that I always find about Imperial Struggle is, out of all the games I play, in that one I feel like any action I take seems so interconnected with 4 or 5 other things that I'm tripping dominoes in multiple directions all the time, which I find confusing and exciting in equal measures.
Yeah. Imperial Struggle, there are fewer actions in Imperial Struggle, so the opportunity cost of actions is a little higher, but the actions can also be thicker. There's Imperial Struggle is a little more about making power moves and manufacturing big power moves that you can use. What Napoleon called thunderclaps, right?
Right.
And that is a more historically appropriate vibe, right? Like Twilight Struggle is about crisis management, right? You draw your cards and you're like, wow, what do I do with this? How do I make the most out of this hand and minimize the damage that the cards that I just drew will do to me? That is not really historically appropriate for the 18th century. Instead, what you're trying to do is put together dramatic moves that will change the fate of a region, and establish your dominion.
How did you and Jason decide that was going to be the next? That Imperial Struggle was going to be your next focus after Twilight Struggle.
So just like the seed of doing the Cold War came from me, the seed of doing Britain versus France came from Jason. It was just something that he was passionate about, and he thought it was fascinating, and that was another place where, once again, I kind of had to catch up on the history.
And the history is even longer there, right?
Yeah, it is. And it has, and the design challenge, there were a lot of design challenges with Imperial Struggle, but one of them was we are explicitly going to do the opposite of what we did in Twilight Struggle, which is we are going to have systemic wars that are fought. So this is gonna have major wars take place during the game between the two antagonists, and we also don't want the player to have to learn how to play 2 different games.
Right.
And so what we end up with in Imperial Struggle is what you see.
Yeah, there's in between each of the periods there's a war, but it's that gets fought out, but not in a like, let's put this on the board and move the pieces around way. It's more like a chunk, and then we're done. We count up the points and see how it happens, and then we see what the repercussions are based on the outcome of that war.
That's right.
I love that. Now I'm thinking about both those games, and I'm thinking about what you talked about earlier about trying to keep as many of the rules on the cards and keep the rule book. I don't know, maybe I heard you in a podcast or in an interview. I think it was you a couple of years ago talking about user experience or user interface. I've always appreciated that in these games. It's got to be something you're into.
Yeah, I think I talked to Harold about that.
Oh, that could be, yeah.
Maybe. It might have been in his podcast. I have, yeah. I mean, there are game design decisions that one makes in paper. For example, one of the, excuse me, one of the things, like as a baseline, like, one of the things you don't want people to have to do is lean across the table and read cards that belong to the other player, right? So if I've got this card that I play in front of me and it's got abilities and stuff on it, that's of interest to my opponent, and I don't want to make it hard or necessary for my opponent to have to constantly lean across the table to see what my capabilities are, right? That's risky. Now, of course, we broke that rule a little bit in Imperial Struggle with the Ministry cards, and but I think it was worth it, and we didn't break it that badly because there's not that many Ministry cards.
Right.
But I've seen games where you put together a tableau and if you really want to optimize how you're playing the game, you really have to go and stare at your opponent's tableau for a little while, and if that involves turning cards upside down or rotating them because they're sitting across the table or on your left or right, that's kind of a playability issue.
Well, and it feels like you've got to focus on keeping everything you need on the board, and you're not looking at charts and looking things up. And
yeah. So like that's another example in Imperial Struggle. Quite late in development, we had so in Imperial Struggle you buy war tiles to put into the wars, and those affect your strength, and they can be the ones you start with can be good or bad. The ones you buy are always good. But one of the things that we had was war tiles that had custom powers, right? So that were era specific, right? So you'd have in the 7 Years' War, you'd have like Montcalm as a tile, and he would have a special power, right? And so there was a reference chart for, because we couldn't write what the power was and everything on the tile.
Yeah, they're not so.
There's a reference chart, and so the problem is when you're playing, if I see you buy a tile and you look at the tile and then you reach for the reference chart, I know which tile you've bought, right? Or I have a good idea of what tile you've bought, and that's a playability issue. That's a usability. So we killed it, right? We killed it. Now I'm thinking about bringing that back. I'm thinking about bringing back era-specific tiles, but you can be assured that it won't involve consulting a reference chart, because otherwise, because that really just doesn't work in person.
This whole idea of user experience I don't know what you do outside of designing games. Is it like, are you involved? Is that part of your day job? Do you like?
Yeah. I'm the design director on League of Legends Teamfight Tactics, which is Riot Games' auto battler. We launched back in 2019, so we're over 5 years old now. I find that hard to believe. As we are speaking right now, we're on the verge of releasing our 13th set, Into the Arcane, which is it's going to be live in less than 2 weeks. And user interface is just part of video game development.
It's I think video games, they take that way more seriously often than paperboard games do.
I think that's right.
What do you take from your video game design user interface? Understand, how do you port that knowledge over? Like, does it help you to understand user interface on a board game better?
There are a lot of heuristics there, right? Like, one of the things that we constantly ask when designing video games, both from a gameplay and from a user experience point of view, is at every moment, what does the player want, right? Whenever the player is undertaking a particular task, like having a clear idea of what the player tasks are and understanding what they want when they're executing that task, right? How do they make that task in the most informed way? What information do they need to feel smart or clever making that decision? And then is it satisfying when they do? That is, I think, at the center of video game development.
Fantastic.
And I think that is something that I try to bring into board games. The idea of satisfying moments or of satisfying gameplay is something that I think board games do to a very wide variance. I'll give an example. Like, one of my favorite examples of satisfying board game play is in Brass Birmingham, where For various buildings, that's an Industrial Revolution themed economic game. It's one of my favorite games of all time. Both the original Brass and the new Brass Birmingham, newish Brass Birmingham, and the buildings that you build are various coal mines and iron mines and or iron works and cotton mills and so forth. And when you build one of these things, what you want to do is promote it, right? You want to flip the tile, and the way you flip each tile is broadly different, right? So a coal mine is flipped when it doesn't have any more coal cubes on it, meaning it's being used at full capacity. And so when you flip it, it gives you an income boost and a VP boost, and that's an incredibly satisfying moment. The game is Brass Birmingham is very good at telling the player when they're playing it right.
Oh yeah, right.
And I think board games that do that, board games that communicate to the player very clearly that they did something right, that's good design, right? That's good mechanical and good user experience design. There are video games that commit the error of not celebrating important things and over celebrating unimportant things, and I think board games often fall into a flat area where they don't have the player do things when the player is doing things that are when the player is playing the game well. The physical actions and the impact on the game state don't reflect that, and I think that's I think board games achieve this to like I said to a varying level, and some of them do it very well and some of them don't.
Right. I feel there's a similar problem sometimes, a wide variance in games where you get the thing set up, you've read the rules and stuff. Some games are really good at giving you an idea of what to do to begin, but some games you just go like, I know what the victory conditions are, I know what the objectives, but I just have no idea about what to do first, and I find that kind of game really frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, historical games have a bit of a cheat here, right? Because if you're confused, you can at least do what was historically done, and see how that could be made to happen using the rule set, and then from there you can innovate, right? For games that don't have a historical context, that's, I think, a bigger problem. Or if you are playing a historical game but you have no idea what actually happened.
That sometimes that often happens because for lots of people, a certain historical game is their gateway into that. Like, I didn't know anything about such and such conflict. I bought this game about it. I'm going to learn about it through the game, and it's like, I'm not learning anything here.
Yeah. I mean, another element of game is choice overload, right? So of design is limiting choice overload, right? So, Struggle of Empires, Martin Wallace's design, which is another one of my favorite games, nonetheless has what I consider to be a design weak point, which is that at the beginning of the game, there's this enormous variety of special ability tiles you can buy, and in order to teach the game, you basically have to teach the players what they all do, because getting tiles early in the game is very important, right? Before they're exhausted, right? Before they're depleted, and so as a result, a lot of the times when you teach this game, you're either taking the route of, with the newbies, telling them, look, this is the tile you should draft, right? Or you're letting them make their own decision, and they are just puzzling through.
Right, they have no idea what's good versus bad in the early stage of the game.
Yeah, that's right. And so like that is, and that's what tech trees are supposed to solve. And so you limit the choice, or you invert the funnel, right? So there's only a few choices early, but they branch a lot, and so then by the end you have maybe more choices. That doesn't really work for that game, though, right? Like that. I mean, I see why Wallace didn't do that in this game. Like he is encouraging players to essentially build a spec for their faction, for their power, and you kind of have to get a head start on that early because of the scarcity of some of the very good tiles, and that's going to define your play style and your capabilities for the rest of the game, and that's what he wants the game to be about. and so there's no avoiding it.
Well,
Maybe there is. There might be, but like
it sounds like a bit like Sebastian Bay's Literal Commander, where you outfit there's a bunch of choices you have to make before you actually start to play, but those choices are really going to affect how you play that game.
Yeah. There are a lot of games like that,
Yeah,
right?
right.
And again, to varying degrees, right? There are games where part of the gameplay, you play with a deck that you might choose beforehand, and usually games will recommend something for a first-time player. They say, "Hey, look, use the cards with stars for your first playthrough."
Right. Yeah.
And that's smart, of course. It does mean that the player has to be a really great experience, because otherwise the player is not going to bother picking it up a second time and customizing a deck. But yeah, I think making. I guess one of the design risks that you have if you're doing that is that it gets back to what I was saying about satisfying moments, right? You want players' choices to lead to satisfying moments when they're done well, and having the player do a whole bunch of highly impactful choices, right? Having the player do a whole bunch of highly impactful choices where the satisfaction is deferred is kind of a risk.
Well, yeah, absolutely, because they have no idea. They have no idea if they're making good choices or not.
Right.
So that satisfaction part is totally up in the air.
Yeah. And so generally, if you're making a game like that, you do want to always make sure that there's some kind of really obvious early game choice that, taking into account play balance and all that, what a player can do early that will feel like they get paid.
Right. Yeah. Well, there's tons of things that go into the user experience too that are the art can be the whole art department can scuttle a otherwise perfectly good design if it leaves a person feeling like they don't know why, but it didn't feel good. It wasn't great.
Yeah. This.
I find that most with, it's not so much the layout and stuff like that, but sometimes there's something about like a good map that lets you understand everything. I'm instantly in it. But a map that makes me try and figure out, is that woods or is that if I'm struggling to see what the map is doing, even without thinking about it, I'm having a negative experience playing the game, no matter how good the game is.
Yeah. I think. So obviously, confusing maps are a problem.
Well, and I find busy maps confusing, so maybe that's just me.
Right. And this is confusing maps are a problem. There's a bigger problem in paper than in digital, because in digital, you can't, the game will simply enforce the rule, right? You're like, oh, I moved my unit here and it costs 2 movement points, even though maybe it doesn't look like one of the 2 movement point hexes. That's annoying, but oh well. Whereas, it can lead to 10 minutes of scrutinizing the map by you and your opponent. You're like, I don't know. Confusing maps are one thing. Ugly maps can be a challenging thing. I've only had a couple of experiences where I've played a game that I liked, where I thought this was a really fun game, but the map was so ugly that I couldn't stand to
play it
anymore. And sometimes this is, I think designers settle for ugly maps for a couple different reasons. They may take the idea of function over form to an extreme. Like a sort of mild example of this is maps where there are hexes and the rivers use very rigid adherence to the hex sides, right? So they have very sharp angles, just like at the hex intersections, which makes them look very unnatural. Mm-hmm. And there is certainly a function argument to be made for that, but it does really make it hard for you to forget that you're playing a game and that it's
And the inverse is also true. I find, like, if I had to choose, I'd rather have form over function, because sometimes or function over form, I should say.
Right.
Because I can think of a few maps where they went too far in the form way, and I can't figure out the function. I can't see the function clearly, and it's like I'm actually trying to play a game.
Yeah, it's generally better to err on that side, but it can be taken too far.
Oh, yeah. I think of I remember games in the 70s where instead of each hex, if it was a woods hex, it was just green, the whole hex. And if it was a hill hex, it was brown, the whole hex. So there was no drawings of hills or woods that,
Right.
it was just like
Right.
everything was just a colored hexagon.
Yeah, and that's, I think that's off-putting these days.
Yeah, I think it is, yeah. Well, so you've got the new Twilight Struggle game.
Yeah, I'm not making progress on that right now.
Right.
Like, all of my board game work is pretty iceboxed right now.
Right. So that's just in the icebox because you're busy at work, or
Busy at work, work's busy, and a couple other side projects are taking some attention.
Well, that's nice. Are we going to see more co-designs with Jason? Is your partnership something that's ongoing?
Yeah, I mean, he and I are collaborating some on the Twilight Struggle 20th Anniversary Edition. Which
Yes,
is coming
right.
out
It's just
from
coming out.
GMT.
Yeah.
That's going to have a new Jason authored scenario in it. I'm obviously going to be providing feedback on the cards and the templating and the feel of them. Jason and I definitely do collaborate. We don't collaborate as tightly on projects as we have in the past, but we do work together and get each other's takes on stuff, especially when it comes to Twilight Struggle,
Right.
Stuff. Jason has other co-designers, right? He's worked with Christian Leonard. He's developing for Fort Circle now, as well. So, I think whenever it's Twilight Struggle, because it really belongs to both of us, we are both pretty invested in it, and so we definitely don't go too far down a path without checking in.
Right, of course. Well, it's been great to meet you and speak with you. This is
likewise, Grant. It's been fun.
I'm always interested to see what you're doing, because I don't know, you and Jason, but the both of you kind of got lightning in a bottle, and so you don't seem to make missteps. I really loved. I liked Imperial Struggle even more than Twilight Struggle.
There are people who feel that way.
Yeah.
And I'm gratified by that.
Yeah, it was like, in no way did I didn't feel like it had to be Twilight Struggle. I wasn't one of those people who saw Struggle on the box and thought it was going to be, the same thing 300 years earlier. That wasn't it. So I was really happy. So I'm interested. All that to say, I'm interested to see what you do next. And if it's in the Xbox for now, I'll I've got a few more years in me. I can wait.
Hopefully you can wait for it to thaw a bit.
Yeah, thanks. Well, thanks for being my guest, and enjoy the rest of the convention.
Thanks for having me, Grant. I really appreciate it.
His attention to the user experience, especially trying to anticipate what a player is feeling at any given time, and his drive to make the player feel good about their good decisions, man, I tell you, you don't have that conversation with every designer. It was really terrific speaking with Ananda about user interface and all those sorts of things. This episode is also sponsored by Cube for Me. Cube for Me has quickly established themselves as the premier providers of storage solutions for historical board games. We're talking counter trays and card boxes. One of the best things about their trays is they come in a variety of configurations. 4x5, 4x3, 3x5, etc. And also a variety of depths. And one tray can serve as the lid for the next if you're looking to save space and not put a lid on everything. This will save space and maybe eliminate box lid lift. Check out my website or the newsletter for my link. Use that to order the trays, and then they'll know I sent you. They're in Poland, but I was amazed how reasonable the shipping was. Okay, for our game this time, we have Medieval Commands and Colors, and we'll talk about it and its expansion. Commands and Colors Medieval was a much anticipated item, but when it finally arrived, it was not universally loved. It seems many fans heard the word medieval and were hoping for knights and battles from the 100 Years' War or something like that. Instead, they got battles between the Huns and the late Roman Empire, bridging the times between ancients and the medieval period, and then battles from the earliest part of the medieval period battles between the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid Persians. There's a fair bit of grumbling about the fact that the series had started so early and that the plan was to go forward chronologically, meaning it might take several expansions before the Commands and Colors series got to the 100 Years' War. Designer Richard Borg and GMT heard those complaints and decided that instead of going chronologically, they're going to skip forward about 500 years, not all the way to the 100 Years' War, but at least to the Crusades. So this first expansion deals with the Crusaders fighting a variety of opponents and includes some of those knights folks we're looking forward to. I'm not going to go into a detailed breakdown of how Commands and Colors Medieval works. If you're unfamiliar with the Commands and Colors system, check out the very first episode of Pushing Cardboard, where I describe Commands and Colors Ancients. It's the basis upon which most of the newer games have been built. So I'll just discuss how Medieval differs from Ancients. Medieval has all the standard Commands and Colors elements. The board is divided into 3 sections. There's a deck of action cards. You have the standard variety of light, medium, or heavy troops. There's a little difference in the number of dice you roll. Each type of troop gets. For example, in Ancients, heavy infantry gets 5 dice, but in Medieval, heavy infantry gets 4. So there's a few changes like that, but they're not big. They don't make a huge difference. In terms of units, the big difference is there are now rules for superior armor and superior stature. These are both a bit fiddly, but easy enough to learn. In broad strokes, each level of unit has superior armor to the level below it. That is, heavy, the red units, have superior armor to medium, the blue units, and medium has superior armor to light, the green units. But also within those groups, there's differentiations. If we look at heavy, for example, which is indicated by the red squares with an outline have superior armor to just plain red squares. The same go for medium or blue troops. The effect of this differentiation is that when a unit attacks a unit with superior armor in close combat, the first sword hit will not count. So it's a very small effect, but it does come into account. As for superior stature, that's all about the difference between infantry and cavalry. Simply put, cavalry will ignore one sword hit rolled against them by any foot unit. The other big change in Medieval as compared to Ancients is the addition of inspired actions. Each side gets a number of inspired action tokens that can be spent on leadership actions or battle actions. As well, each nationality has a unique set of leadership and battle actions on its own inspired actions player aid. At least that's the theory. In actuality, many of the actions are the same for both armies with just a couple of differences. The number of inspired action tokens each side gets at the beginning of the game is different from scenario to scenario, and it's not always symmetrical. As well, there's ways to gain inspired action tokens during play. If you think of the deck of cards in Commands and Colors as being divided between leadership orders cards and tactics cards such as First Strike or Line Command, you could think of inspired actions as being very specific tactics cards. They're easily the biggest change from Commands and Colors Ancients. There's also small changes to the evade rules and something called the Parthian Shot, a very special evade move for light bow cavalry that lets them fight back after they evade. And then that's basically it. Otherwise, Medieval plays mechanically, much like Ancients. When I first played Medieval, I found the new armor and stature rules a bit fiddly. I kept forgetting them, frankly. I felt they were a little too much chrome for a game that is as abstract as Commands and Colors. But the more I played, the easier it was to remember them. The inspired action cards did feel like a fresh change in the same way the special deck in the Samurai box was, or the way that Marshals and Tacticians expansion was for the Napoleonic version. Add in the fact that each new army for every expansion to Medieval is supposed to get their own set of inspired actions, and it promises to create more variety going forward. This first expansion to Medieval Crusades makes good on that promise. You get a new set of actions for the Crusaders, and then 3 new sets of actions for their opponents. One for the Ayyubids, one for the Fatimid, and a final one that's shared by the Seljuk Turks and the Artukid. As well, this new box brings a variety of new rules, including the much waited for knights, knight cavalry, and even Templars and Hospitallers. There's also a few new rules in this expansion. Special rules for knight cavalry that get a little out of hand and go maybe farther than you want. Rules for feigning retreats. Rules for relics, and for the possibility of panic after retreat. The last one is a bit like the morale rules in the Tricorn series. There's 19 scenarios in the core box and another 20 in the Crusaders expansion, so there's plenty of replayability here. Although I do find it a bit more fiddly than Ancients, I've enjoyed playing Medieval and its first expansion. It's always fun to have new units to explore, I have to admit. And while I'll probably always prefer the straightforward simplicity of Ancients, I'd never turn down the chance to play this new medieval game as well. It's pretty good. All right, time for our second interview. I didn't expect to interview Mark Herman in San Diego this year, but when the opportunity arose, I jumped at it. Of course, that means I didn't have any questions prepared or even a loose theme that I wanted to explore. But I did have a few questions that had been rattling around in my brain related to his work, so I finally got my chance. Here's our discussion. Well, here we are in beautiful San Diego, and I'm talking with Mark Herman. How are you, Mark?
I'm very well, thank you, Grant.
It's great to see you. You were going to come here last year, and then something came up, and you didn't.
Yeah, I had COVID.
Oh, you had COVID. Yeah, so that was
that slowed me down, and I didn't feel like sharing.
So we didn't get to have that. We were going to have a chat last year, but we get a chance to have it this year, just on the fly. You've been? I see you running around doing everything here. Like you're playing. You're also demoing Rebel Fury, or
so. So what ends up happening with this con, Harold Buchanan does a great job with this con, and he goes to me as he's playing. He goes, "Would you be willing to do?" I don't even listen to him. I just say yes, and then when I get here, I go, "What am I supposed to be doing?" So he had wanted to have 2 Rebel Fury events. So I had one. Today's Saturday. So yesterday I had one at 9. We had 4 games going. And today we had another one at 9. So I think we had another 4 games going. And then I brought Army of the Potomac, but we're playing what I want my idea, I'm always looking for something fun to do. So Army of the Potomac has basically 4 maps and 4 one-map scenarios. But you can bolt the whole thing together and play the campaign.
I saw it on the table out there. It looks like it's about 12 feet long.
It is 12 feet long because it's 4 maps.
Right.
But and then what I did was I started playing with Gary Mengel, Ard Wolf.
Yeah, Ard Wolf. Yeah,
so we started playing and we were having a good time. And then we broke for lunch. And then anybody comes along and looks like, oh, that looks really cool. I said, you want to play? So people have been coming and playing 1 or 2 turns. So the campaign's been advancing as I put new generals in. So, but now the Worley brothers, Cole and Drew, seem to have really grasped on. So it's like their game now. So they're fighting each other. So we're getting close to the north. We've moved off the first map and we're now well into the second map, moving towards Richmond. Yeah, so it's going really well. It's fun to watch.
That game. Is it? I know it's. Is it meant to have all the maps put together like that, or
only if you want to?
Right.
No. I told you there are each map, just like in Rebel Fury. There's 6 scenarios that don't require more than 1 map, and that's you have. At Spotsylvania Courthouse, there was a second battle on May 18th, and then there's the Battle of the North Anna. Then there's Cold Harbor. And then you have then it's also going to remember the Army of the Potomac because it's also got the 7 days battle in McClellan. So you've got Mechanicsville, and 7 Pines, and then you have the big 7 days battle. So you get those, and each of those plays on 1 map.
Right.
So 2-3 hour experiences max. But because I have all the maps, it was always my plan. You can put them together, or imagine you got a treadmill. So as you go off 1 map, you can roll the second map under it and just keep moving.
Keep moving all.
So you can still do it under reason. You wouldn't have to put them all together at one time.
Right.
But if you have a floor, you should just do it to see it.
Just see it, right? Yeah. You don't have to have 12 feet, but if you do, check it out.
But you can play it across. But like I said, as you move off from 1 map onto the other, you just pull the maps out. Just everybody. We have clever people in our gamers are clever. Yeah. They'll figure it out. But then I get to so if you get Army of the Potomac and you play the 1 map scenarios, and you know how to play Rebel Fury, you have to do nothing. There's no rule changes, nothing.
Right.
So you just play it right out of the box. But if you want to play the campaign, there is a couple of notches up of, you have to have some logistics and casualties and all this other stuff. But, if you're going to go do that, it's still not very complex, but it's got more decisions.
Right. But if you're
but only if you're playing that campaign, only if you're doing that. Otherwise, you don't need it.
And if you're into doing the campaign, which is going to be a little bit of overhead for the campaign, is nothing compared to the time you're going to put into the experience.
Right. But the cool part is I was always had East Front. You go to a convention, you see those East Front guys. They got all those maps and they got 14 million counters, and I always had envy. So I've got the 12 maps, but I only have 40 counters.
Right. Yeah.
So a lot of room, but very few counters. So a lot of maneuver. It's really fun.
Well, I think that's the fun thing about Rebel Fury, right? Is
the maneuver. Like we get so tired of games where, especially Ancients games, they go, well, here they are, and you smash into each other and see what happens. But in Rebel Fury,
a bitch, isn't it?
yeah, it's true. Yeah, well, and same with medieval games. Right?
Yeah,
It's like
sure.
boom, boom, boom. But with this, like, it's less about the battles, or the combat. It's more about the.
So let me, if I can refine that thought.
Yeah.
So we all know what a tactical game is, right? You know, it's like regiments and artillery batteries, and we all know like what the operational level is. You know, you got corps running around with, you know, and then you've got like games like, you know, For the People or U.S. Civil War, where you're playing, you know, the whole war.
Yeah.
But there is actually a distinct real level called the Grand Tactical Level, was defined by Jomini. He said it was maneuver combinations prior to and during a battle. So Rebel Fury is built around that one sentence. So it is you are General Grant running an army. You're not worrying about this, that, or that, but you are maneuvering. That's why it's got so much maneuver, because it is the Grand Tactical Level. And combat is a necessary part of it, but you're trying, if you do it right, you get there before they do, and they have to attack you. Fredericksburg and all that. That's what they knew. They knew that. And you know, a lot of people have asked me, like, you know, what are your research sources? And so there's something called the Official Records of the Rebellion. If you look at any history, Civil War book, it's called the OR.
The OR,
and it's 128 volumes. And because of my age, you know, a lot of the books that I've read over my lifetime didn't exist. You know, it was a centennial in 1960 when I was a kid. So I used to read the original reports and correspondence of what I was reading as a child.
Oh, Jesus.
You know, well, and Bruce Catton was writing great stuff. You know, that was that era, but that was where I come from. So when people say, well, that's not true, I go, well, this is what General Grant said. You know, that's how I look at these things, you know.
Yeah, and there's nothing like a first-hand thing. I agree that there's value in analysis and taking, like, what three people said about the very same thing and go, where does the truth lie there? But if you're just making it up out of whole cloth because you got a theory, I'm going to go with what they said.
Yeah. So one of the interesting things, so in a lot of our war games, in anything in the 19th century, I'm not talking about, you know, World War II, but I'm talking about the 19th century, you know, Napoleonics and the Civil War in particular. So General Grant wrote a report to Henry Halleck. I would say it would be around May 12th in the evening, and he reports on the capture of the Mule Shoe, which was like this big battle at Spotsylvania Courthouse, which is very, very bloody. But the way he describes casualties, he doesn't talk about losses of men, losses of organizations. And his claim to Halleck was, we knocked out two rebel organizations. They actually knocked out Johnson's division and Dole's brigade. We didn't lose one organization, he says, even not one company. So he didn't think about, I lost. So linear losses of men meant nothing to Grant. Do I have all the pieces? Do I have all my pieces?
Do I still have, like, is there
maneuver
enough
elements
for cohesion of that this is still here?
And so that is what I use as the basis of my thinking for the entire attrition model, because that's what he thought. I want you to be him, not be, you know. And then people will say, like, you know, how come Woods is the same as a Ridge? Or, you know, why is it both +3? And the answer is, what is the rationale that it's anything other than it's better? Yeah. There's people, like a lot of games, and they like to make this, well, this is a +2, this is +3, this is +4. And the answer is, everybody figured out very quickly when you're getting shot at, get behind something or get down.
Right, it's either defensive terrain or it's not.
Not, exactly.
Yeah.
And
especially at that scale.
And remember, even in a wooded area, there's going to be clearings for farms that are not at a half-mile scale. There's farms all over the place. So there's a lot of open terrain. Yes, the wilderness was a little bit more dense than other places, but there were plenty of farms, like the Tripp farm. They fought over all those farms because that's where they could see each other.
Right. And also that's great cover.
Well, that's the other thing. And people say, like, artillery doesn't work as well in woods. That is true, except that, well, these clearings, they would put like 2 guns, and nobody could cross the clearing.
Right.
So, and the other thing that's always in there is, like, how many guns do you have? And again, Gettysburg is a little bit different. You know, it had a lot of open ground and a lot of batteries, but in most of the battles of the Civil War, a gun battery could run out of artillery, you know, shell, you know, ammunition in about 90 minutes, 2 hours.
So it's more about the ammunition.
And that's what I track. You track ammunition. So if you want continuous artillery support, you wouldn't necessarily pull the guns back and give another gun battery unless you didn't have, but if you had, the wagons would come and give them more ammunition, but it was the same guys.
Right.
Because moving them back and moving forward is very hard in that terrain.
Yeah.
So as long as you have continuous, and remember, the other thing is it's a direct fire war. There's no, you don't have 155 howitzers firing over people's heads, and you can't shoot those kind of guns over your own people's heads without killing your own people, which they would try. I mean, it happened, but they try to avoid it. So I can get there's no such thing as force ratios in the Civil War that make any sense, because they have the same number of guys per square foot as you do. And
right. So this idea of 3 to 1 is not.
It makes no sense. Now, what you do get is, if I bring enough guys, I might, and they can never really, you think about trying to coordinate any group of people across a mile. So they were always like, the assaults went in an uncoordinated manner. And a lot of games you spend a lot of time rolling dice to say, was it coordinated? Now, the answer is you're rolling dice to find something that rarely happened. They're almost always uncoordinated. And every so often, and when you roll a good die roll, somehow yours was coordinated that time.
The coordinated or not is just in how well you roll.
Yeah, exactly. Well, remember, in every combat results table is a distribution of some kind. Although there's no rolling, I always have this thing: rolling 0 is just bad. Doesn't matter what, and that was always true. There's always something that would just go. It could literally be bees or hornets. I mean, you've seen all these weird events in games. Well, that stuff happened,
Yeah.
So that's what a 0 is. But the thing is that there is a myth amongst gamers that if I roll more dice and I have more procedures, it's more accurate. And that's just mathematically it's fun. It creates sometimes a great narrative, but it's nonsense mathematically.
Right.
It's just not true.
Yeah.
And so, again, I really tried when I did this game, going back to Gettysburg and Waterloo and now this one, I really tried to reimagine how a hex encounter game can be. Now, I'm not saying it's the most brilliant thing in the world. I'm not saying it's innovative beyond all belief, but it is. I don't know that there's a lot of parallel games to it, even in the past. So I've really tried to open up you can move as often as you want until you can't, and you can shoot as much as you want until you run out of guys or effort or whatever.
I totally love that about it. And I mean, people who listen to my show know I'm a big fan of Courtney Allen's Area Impulse games.
Yes,
and that,
I know Courtney.
Yeah, so yours is even more, but that thing that breaks down the I go, you go thing into I move one, you move one, I love that. And you've taken it one step further with, in his system, once they move, then, somebody else has got to move. But with you, it's just, we go until one guy says, okay, enough.
Or you run into each other, you can't move.
And then you can't move.
Yeah.
They're sticky.
And what would happen in the Civil War would be, so imagine you got a column of guys moving forward, or, remember that you can only go where you can walk. So the roads through these dense terrain is everybody's on the road until you get to another group of guys and there's some openings or whatever.
That's why we have so many battles at the crossroads.
There's always at a crossroads. That's exactly right. Because you run into each other where the roads meet. It's not that complicated. But what would happen is the first unit would run into somebody, and if they could knock them aside, they would. But if they got stuck, as the guys coming up behind them came up, they peel off to the left and right, and so battle lines would form.
Right.
And that's what happens in Rebel Fury. The battle lines form organically based on that simple principle. So once you're in a ZSC, you're locked, you just see the lines just form. I mean, there's no rules for it. It just does. It just happens. And that's what I was looking for.
Yeah, it's totally organic.
That's what was the point.
Yeah. So, I mean, the first volume, the one that's out now, it seems like it's sold like hotcakes and
it's sold out.
Yeah, everybody's playing, and
I'm very happy about that.
Sure
I want to be clear. I am humbled that people are excited. I wanted a game that you could see. You guys can't see me on the thing, but I'm going to turn 70 in 1 week, and so. While I've done many complicated games, and I admire detailed, intricate games, I'm at the point now I want to have some games in my collection where I can sit down and play to be done in 2 hours. But my idea was, you have lunch, you start the game at 1, and you're watching the 4 o'clock football game on time.
Yeah.
3 hours, I'm done. Yeah. I had a good time, and moving on. And I also wanted to, I have a ton of games where it covers one battle. So you get the game, you play it out, but I gave you 6 battles. I'm trying to give good value.
Well, to me, it reminded me kind of like the old quads.
It was, which I was copying.
Yeah.
But I don't know, how do you call it?
It's a sexquisite. I don't know. A sextet. I don't know.
Sextarian. I don't.
Yeah.
I know. I'm going to be a septuagenarian. So what was it when I was 60? I don't remember. Anyway, whatever that word is, that's what you get. But And the other thing I wanted to do was, there are people who have, team, groups that they play with. So I went out of my way that there's 3 separate maps. Every battle has its own counter. So you could play 3 battles simultaneously with 6 people, each playing a different battle, but you all have your own counters, and you have the full set.
It's fantastic because I have like these little containers. I go, Chancellorsville's in this, Fredericksburg's in this, and like it all. That like you've just got 6 little things, and you have the whole game in one little thing.
And also from the very one time, Berg, I love Berg. And one time, I forget which of his Civil War games. It was the one where the cannons were like my detachments. Like they were like half-inch detachments. I think it's the Glory system. Yeah, it is the Glory system. Great system. And I think the first volume, there's multiple scenarios, but there's nothing on the counters to tell you which battle they go to. And I knocked the tray over. And I'm going, and I literally, and I stopped playing that particular. I just I put them in a bag. I wasn't gonna say it was just a mess. I put them all together, and I still have them in a bag. So this time I said to Charlie Kibler, who the artist, I said every counter will have a distinct letter code for its battle. Because when I do it the next time, I don't want to do that.
Do that, yeah.
You learn from your mistakes,
Yeah, but that's right. You learn from the mistakes and even the mistakes of others.
Yeah.
Well, I want to transition to something else here because you talked about you like light games, but you also like complicated games. And the recentish re-release and reimagining or whatever you want to call it of Pacific War.
Yeah.
So there's complicated and like in a way compared to Rebel Fury.
I use the word complicated. I now favor it's intricate.
Right, totally fine.
Yeah, and because complicated, it's nothing in it is. I mean, it's just a lot of it, and there's a lot of things. It's got a lot of gears meshing together, and that could be a lot to keep in your mind.
Right. Yeah.
And
I like those kind of games.
Me too.
I mean, Empire of the Sun is also intricate.
Yes.
Right. But when Pacific War came back out, and I thought, Mark Herman designed that in the
85.
80s. Yeah, that came out. That was originally a victory game.
Yes, it was.
And then he does all these years later. He does Empire of the Sun.
2005.
Totally right. So 20 years later, and it's the same band of research in a way, but looking at this. 2 completely different takes on the same big picture.
Well, I would say that what it really is the same topic at 2 different scales. So Pacific War is an operational level game.
Right. Right. I totally get that.
And I put the strategic scenario in because I had to. See, if it was, this was victory when I made those decisions, but I might have said, I could have broken it into like a series. Like here's the South Pacific, here's the Dutch East Indies.
Right.
It just so happened I did the whole thing at one time, so I wasn't going to go disassemble that. But it always had the 4 levels of scenarios, and it was always meant to be it was the camp. So you have, for those that don't have it, there's engagement scenarios. They're just like 15-minute train. You'd have roll 4 dice, Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, that kind of stuff. Oh, the Wake Island scenario was pretty fun. And then there's the battle scenarios, which we had tournaments in that stuff. And just to give you, everybody goes, how long does it take to play? So I was at, it was GMT East, and I had, the game had just come out again, and I was teaching the guys who had kind of played it when they were, younger. And it took with the teach and the play of Coral Sea, which is like the good solid battle play, took them like 3 hours. The next day, this guy Gary Gonzalez, who I've been playing with since the last 60 years, since 3rd grade, he was the developer on the game. We set it up the next day in the morning, and I remember Lewis was there, and we finished it in 90 minutes.
Right.
So it's not so we play it. We know it very well,
and that's the battle scenario, right?
Yeah, that's a battle, and that's like a nice sit down, play a game, you're done kind of situation. But the campaigns are with the multi-month turns. And if you go on YouTube, I play the Watchtower, first turn of the Watchtower out, so you can see all the moving parts. that's where the game's meant to be played.
And that's like kind of like an operational level.
It is the operational
Right,
level,
yeah,
absolutely operational level. So then there's the strategic scenarios, and that's where you set it, the whole war, and it's going to take you 200 hours, and again, it's the part where people admire it, but nobody's finishing that game.
Everybody who's loving that game is playing the battle scenarios and the operational scenarios.
The campaign scenarios, right? Which are they're all operational, but it's so like a battle scenario is just one operation. A campaign is multiple operations over months.
Right, and then the big thing is all the operations.
Roll the whole war, and then you're starting to get into the strategic warfare, bombers and submarines, and sinking merchant ships and all that stuff. So the logistics becomes more intricate.
Right. But like you said, people are less likely to be playing that big strategic scenario. Well, the stuff just underneath that.
They want to, and so many people would start off with that, and they'd never played the game before, and they go, "Oh, it's so hard." They go, "Well, I didn't told you not to do that," but nobody ever listens to me anyway. But then when I did Empire, the thing that happened when I finished it in '85 was I said to myself, someday I can't play the whole war. It's really meant to be the Guadalcanal campaign or the Bougainville, Cartwheel and that stuff.
Yeah.
So Empire of the Sun began really in the 90s when I said, I really want to do a game about the war. And so you can play Empire of the Sun in 6-7 hours. That's a whole day. But but it's got multiple scenarios that play in 3 hours. And I always feel like every one of my games has a 3-hour scenario. So like everybody likes For the People's been out for 25 years. And when we play the WBC, which is the World Board Gaming Championships, people will play the whole campaign. It takes about, with people who know what they're doing, that's like a 4-5 hour exercise. But I only play the 1863 scenario, and right away it's, Grant's getting ready to go to Vicksburg, and Lee's getting ready to do Gettysburg and Chancellorsville, and so right into the action. It's 3 turns, and it takes me 2 hours to play that.
Right.
So as long as my game has a 2-hour or 3-hour scenario, I feel like there's value to anybody who buys it. And if you want to play the campaign, God love you, I do sometimes, but that's a lot of time these days.
Well, so when those 20 years go by and you go, I want to be able to do the whole thing, and you start working on Empire of the Sun, how much more research did you have to do on top of what you've done? Obviously, there's probably a boatload of new books and things that.
Yeah, it was more the. Yes, there was. So when I did the original Pacific War, you have, the Barry and the Javelin and Empires in the Balance by, it'll come to me in a second. And then you've got, the whole, U.S. Navy in World War II series and all that, But what happened in the meantime was a lot more books came out about the war in China. Because when I did the original Pacific War, I had 2 books. One was some Chinese nationalist general who was writing his memoirs from Taiwan. And from there, I knew, again, in English at that time, in the mid-'80s, there wasn't a lot of stuff. And so I had that book, and there was some other book also that wasn't, gave me some information, but definitely not brilliant stuff. But since then, there's just, Tower of Skulls. And there's been at least, I can think of, there's actually, in fact, a whole historical movement now when I was doing the game that's really looking at the fact that Asia was a bigger war than Europe, that more people got, sadly were killed, and, more horrible things happened. Obviously the Holocaust, as a Jewish guy, Holocaust, affects my family, and it's a horrible thing. But the war, the Germans, it was a small, even the East Front is a smaller war than China.
Than China, yeah.
And I think that, and it's interesting that the Chinese government, even though Chiang Kai-shek is not, he's been resurrected by them because they realize that he saved them from the Japanese. And so it's kind of they must have a weird love-hate relationship with them. So there's been a lot more stuff that, what's her name? Barbara Tuchman wrote this book, Stilwell and the American Experience in China. And she beats up on Chiang Kai-shek badly. So that was my impression when I did the original Pacific War, because that was the only one that was the other book that I was reading that really had some detail of what's going on in the CBI. But when you now look at it, Chiang Kai-shek actually was not an idiot.
No.
And he was a lot better than he thought.
He was stuck between 2 things that he was like walking a tightrope.
Well, there was a third party. Some Chinese guys were going to go collaborating with the Japanese. Then you had the communists. So it was so the war in China is a lot more complicated, not because it became it was always known in in Chinese and what it was about. But until that stuff gets translated, I don't read Chinese real well. So, so it was really one of those situations. So that really improved, and in fact, when I did Empire of the Sun, I decided I didn't want to put a major China thing in there because it might, I want the game to focus on the war that was. And so I use a track that becomes a resource sink that every so often, if the Americans or the Allies don't pay attention to it, China falls. And there's strategies that get there, but if the Allies pay attention to it all, what they're doing is they will burn cards to stop it from falling, which is what I wanted it to be.
Right.
It's a resource sink.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's how I handle it there. But now the New Pacific War has a much better, look at the Chinese theater, and it can even get. And now Empire of the Sun, by the way, there's two Chinese guys. He goes by the name of Soju. I don't know what his real name is, obviously. He's on Board Game Geek. He has now added a whole China thing to Empire of the Sun, and we're testing that right now. And we'll put it out in C3I or GM. We're going to get it out there somewhere, but right now we're testing it. But so the map, that part of the map that was just like tracks is now actually terrain.
Terrain, right.
And there's pieces, and we've been, working out and you play some cards play differently, but it's kind of cool. So.
And does it is an add-on that you add into and it makes a bigger Empire of the Sun, or
it's not physically bigger. It just takes that piece of the map and puts terrain in it with pieces.
But you play it with the.
You play the whole thing.
It's not just like a separate game.
No, it's not a separate game like South Pacific. No, it's part of the main game. And I'm just not sure how we're gonna do it yet, but it exists, and we're playing it. On Consum World, there's a bunch of guys playing it, so we're figuring it out. But it'll get out someday.
Oh, fantastic!
But remember, these guys are Chinese, so they actually they got the order of battle. They got the stuff that I can't.
They've got access to a whole bunch of.
Well, they read stuff that I can't read.
Yeah.
It's very cool.
You seem to have a huge interest in the Pacific.
I do.
Do you have a family connection to that? It's like
so I had an uncle. Well, his name was Henry Klein. Henry, but because the Marine Corps being as clever, because his name was Henry, right? He was Chick,
Chick, yeah.
Yeah. So my uncle Chick, that's what we called him. He was in the Marine 5th Regiment, and he fought on Guadalcanal. And whenever my uncle Chick drank too much, he would talk about Guadalcanal, and he was always drinking too much.
Which might have something to do with Guadalcanal as well.
Yeah, so so even as a child, I was fascinated by his stories of, that. So even when and by the way, you get Pacific War, there's the two big mountain maps, they're gorgeous and all that, but it comes with a very small footprint map of the South Pacific, and you can play pretty much every scenario. There's more than half the scenarios can be played on that one mini map, and very small footprint, and that's how I kind of play the game. I rarely play, and anything you can't play on the mini map, you can play on one map, that's the A map, and then you only need the B map if you're going to do the whole war or Midway. Otherwise, you don't need the B map. So, the game, I want the game to be played, and that's why you have so many scenarios, and, anyway, so that's where my interest comes from originally, and then, reading books about, so there's a company, I don't know if they exist anymore, called Ballantine.
Oh yeah,
and what happened was, I guess in the 1950s, all of these guys who were in World War II wrote like a memoir of their thing, and so you can find there. I don't know how many volumes of Ballantine, but there's a famous Brazen Chariots, which was used as an MMP. It was an MMP, BCS title. It's by a guy named Major Crisp. And, so there's all these books, and I read a whole bunch about these, Destroyer Captain and, Nighttime in the Solomons. And so those books really, I read all those as a kid, and they really fired me up on this Pacific stuff. And, let's face it, you can't swing a dead cat in the room and not hit it in a European game.
Yeah,
so,
it's true. Yeah.
Yeah, but so, I like, I picked a Rebel Fury fits into a scale that nobody's playing. I like to try to go where, nothing's being done. And Pacific never has gotten the treatment that Europe has gotten.
You're also big on, do you have a history degree?
I do.
And
Ancients.
Ancients, right. So you like Peloponnesian War and like...
That was my... Yeah, so in fact, did you see? You saw copies of my. There's a few copies of my book here.
I hope to get one.
Yeah, but we'll get you one. We'll talk to Rachel. She'll figure that out. But the three, in my mind, the three areas that I have taught that I feel I know a lot about is, and in my book I have a section in the back on designing within 5th century BC Greece, the American Civil War, and the Pacific. Those are three areas that I've taught, lectured on, and I feel like I know I can hold my own. And in fact, if I had gotten I was working on getting into a doctoral program when I was like 60, and the only thing that stopped me, I had a topic and everything, they were ready to take me, but they were saying it was going to take me 7 years. And I didn't feel like going from 67 being in school for a purpose that I couldn't figure out. So I decided to design games and and write books. And but now that I finished this book, I'm going to do my doctoral dissertation by myself without a degree.
Oh yeah,
And to me, the effect of Jomini on the strategic thinking of the American Civil War, which was what I was going to write it about originally, and why I ended up at the grand tactical level even for Rebel Fury. So I'm going to write another book, but I'm going to write a serious history book. I'm going to do a few more things before I kick off.
Yeah. Wow, and it's going to be gravy for us.
Well, yeah, somebody, I guess.
Well, you just finished the book, and you're working on the Rebel Fury. Do you have other game design irons in the fire?
Yeah, absolutely. So with a guy named David Doctor who did like Triumph and Chaos, we've got Defiant.
And used to do a great podcast. I'm kind of filling in for him while he's been concentrated on the Ukraine.
Hey, David, if you're listening to this, which I know you will be eventually, you need to start up Guns by Dice and Butter.
Yeah.
He threatens to do that a lot. Right now, though, at his house in Jersey, which is where I would be if it wasn't for here, he calls it CastleCon, and all these friends of ours on the East Coast get together and play they're all playing games right as we speak. So, hi to the guys at CastleCon. So I would be there if I wasn't here.
Right, but, and you guys are working together on a game.
Defiance, which is the beginning of the Ukrainian war. And then I'm doing another game, a second game with my good friend Jeff Engelstein called Triumvirate, which is based loosely on Versailles, but it's evolved quite a bit.
So, like the same system as Versailles 1919?
It was, so when I said kissing cousin is a better word.
Totally fine.
Yeah.
Yeah. But what's the setting?
Oh, Triumvirate is you are either Julius Caesar, Crassus, or Pompey, right. And you're basically vying for control of Rome. Right.
Fantastic.
Yeah. And one of the outcomes is there's a crossing the Rubicon card. So some outcomes are the Roman Civil War starts. And in some outcomes, the Republic survives, but somebody wins.
Right. Yeah. Which totally might have happened, right?
And the question. I was asked this question recently. I forget who asked it, but it was in some kind of interview, and they said, "Why is it that you think that what makes war games a different and in some cases better understanding of history?" And the way I described it to them was, did you ever read a book like a travel log where somebody writes about a trip they took and the things they saw? Herodotus, by the way, the first history, is really a travel log, and that's how you get the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And he talks about these places he went, and then, oh, by the way, there was this Greek war in there somewhere.
Yeah.
So a game is like, instead of just reading about that grand drove from walk from here to there, you get to drive the car. Yeah, and you really get an appreciation of how geography and the narrative interact in a way that a book doesn't do well. Unless you really know they give you maps, but somehow it's just never as good as a game in that regard. And you also don't get the feel like where were the real possible forks in the road. Now, there's many games that are very enamored, and I have great experiences with them personally, but where they really believe that there's a very tight lane. They want the historical lane to be the lane. I'm always paths not taken. I don't want ridiculous stuff, but I want plausible things that they talked about that didn't happen.
I read a quote of yours a couple of years ago where that has always stuck with me, because I totally believe it, that the as soon as you make the first move, alternate history begins. And like that's what the real history should be possible, but how we get there, it can be one of 100 ways.
What I say in my book, by the way, is everything I've ever done has been alternate history. If I wasn't alternate history, it would have been a book.
Right, yeah, right.
And in some books, by the way, I'm not sure when I read the book that they're not seeing it almost as alternate history, but I'm just kidding around. But recently somebody got mad at me because I said that, so remember, I've been reading American Civil War books since 1960 when I was five going on 6. And by the way, that's proof that I was not in the American Civil War, by the way. But I've been reading books that long, and so I said, in writing, I haven't seen any books recently that taught me anything new, other than when they had statistics. That's what I wrote. And somebody really reacted very ad hominem, forget about all that, nasty and, saying rude things, but that's beside the point. But I realized that it's not new to me. It might be new to them, but I've been reading this stuff longer. So let me give a coherent example. Say, well, give me an example. So there's a book we recently read, by the way, very good book. If you don't know much about, it's called Meade at Gettysburg, or Meade in Command, something like that. I think it's Meade at Gettysburg. Very good book, and covers his style. But after I read the book, I liked it. But I read a book, so long ago, let's say 25 years ago, called Gettysburg: A Study in Command by Coddington. That book was like literally, it's a study in command, and there was nothing that I read in the new book that I didn't already know from the other book and other books, but that one in particular, and I think there was more in that book. So when I say I didn't learn anything new and you get upset, the answer is, why are you upset? I'm different than you, and I know different things than you. So the fact that you found the book to be great, or the new, more recent stuff to be great, doesn't mean that they're not great books. It just means I did not learn anything new. And the fact that you don't like that is, I don't get it.
Yeah, right. Maybe if they had read the Coddington book.
Coddington book, yeah.
Yeah.
I even wrote a paper on it once for the Military Operations Research Society. I even made the finals, but I lost to two Air Force officers who wrote a great paper on strategic nuclear warfare. So I lost this. So my 19th century book on command lost to strategic nuclear warfare. Hey, what are you going to do?
It feels like there's, I don't know if there's new stuff coming out, but the guys like, I think it's Stephen Sears and...
Oh, he's great, yeah.
I just read his book on Chancellorsville, and it
good book.
And it's like, it's totally changed the way I thought about Hooker, for example, right? Like I didn't...
He's not an idiot.
He's not an idiot at all.
Exactly,
yeah. And same thing... The Last Invasion, or
you're talking about, that's Guelzo's book on Gettysburg.
Yeah.
He's also, see, those are fabulous books, but they were written like a decade ago.
Right. Yeah.
So I'm talking about the most recent books.
The most recent books. Yeah.
And by the way, to give you the first thing you said, Chancellorsville. So when I did Rebel Fury, the thing that I wanted to do was, if I could figure out how to do Chancellorsville with no special rules, I knew I had something, and that was my test. And I do that to myself. I say, if I can do that this way, and there was, again, in the OR, which is, again, the official records of the rebellion, Hooker wrote President Lincoln, you might have heard of him, he wrote him a note on his strategy for this coming battle, and he makes it very clear to Lincoln that if he's going to make this demonstration with Sedgwick across the river towards the entrenchments, to pin them there, and then if Lee pulls away too fast to block his turning movement, he'll turn that into the main attack. So many games on Chancellorsville build in all these special rules that Sedgwick can't do this, to make sure the timing works out perfectly. Forget about all that. If, as a player, if you unskillfully move too many guys too quickly, I'm just going to take the first corps and turn your flank and take the entrenchments, and I win the game that way. So by just doing what was the actual written strategy, I had no special rules. And Chancellorsville can play out the way it is, but it also can play out the way that Hooker said it could have come out. Because so that's how I
Hooker had, Chancellorsville, we always talk about, like, the Jackson's big, he steals a march, but Hooker stole his own march ahead of that.
Grant, you are preaching to the choir, 100% correct. And in fact, what I write, and I just wrote my Cleo's Corner for Roger McGowan and C3I, which is all in great detail about Rebel Fury combat system and everything. And I used that exact example. And Jackson's turning movement was, it's very Shakespearean because, at the height of his power, he gets, mortally wounded. And so it's very memorable to gamers, and it should be. And it can happen in Rebel Fury for exactly without any, organically it can happen. But there were other turning movements. Look at Grant's at, Vicksburg. There's so many good turning movements in the war, and ones that went badly.
And the Hooker one's like right there, just beside it.
And again, as I say, what happened in the battle was Hooker won. Remember the definition of grand tactics. Combinations prior to battle, Hooker won that part. Then combinations during battle, Lee won that part.
Right. Yeah.
And that is really the story of that battle in a nutshell.
Yeah. Well, and you're like you say, your game lets it happen.
Lets it happen, and I love that scenarios. And I had a very nice experience today. So there's what's their lesson? Anyway, if you look on, Roger posted I sent them some pictures, but you had a grandfather, son, and grandson playing Wilderness War, and they played Spotsylvania today, and they played Chickamauga yesterday. I was just heartening to see that.
Yeah.
And then Mark Johnson, not the one who has the podcast, but another Mark Johnson,
Yep.
Canadian guy, very nice guy, by the way, kind of a pretty famous film producer, as it turns out. I had lunch with him today. His 85-year-old father was a historian, and he has literally, he said, he grew up in a house with 3,000 books. So, it's a serious guy. But when he saw Rebel Fury, he wanted to play, loved it, and he wanted a copy. So I feel like
an 85-year-old.
Which, by the way, is not too far in my future, by the way. So I ain't that far. But so those are the things so people, I ain't doing it for the money. That's what I'm doing it for. People are happy, and I'm happy. I'm happy, they're happy, and everybody's happy. So
Yeah. There's not many people in this business that are doing it for the money. It seems.
Well, I made a living at it a couple times.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, it was my whole salary when I was at SPI as a young man when I had no money.
And Victory.
Well, Victory actually had a family, and so I actually was making a salary that allowed me to get a house. It was a real job, and also when I was, even though I was making minimum wage, I at least was able to starve in an apartment in New York and, had a good time. But, so now it's just, I'm back to being a starving artist. I love it.
Yeah, but you get the charge of the guy, his 85-year-old, and plus the grandson both playing.
13-year-old, yeah.
Same thing. I was talking with Volko about
Andrew and his kids. They're great.
Not the kids so much. But we were talking. He was talking about you steal things from different. Like everybody just takes stuff and makes what they want. And he said, when people take something from one of his games and put it in theirs, he doesn't feel like he feels like he's looking at a grandkid. Like he feels a giant sense of pride.
Well, I look. If you think about how the Euro guys adopted card-driven games, and I don't think they even know where it came from.
Right. Yeah.
So I guess I got great grandsons by now, or granddaughters too.
Well, I think that it went there, and then there's been other and then it bounced back. And
we got wood. We got wood out of them.
Yeah, that's right.
We like wood. We've learned to love wood.
Well, yeah, I'll take it. Well, this has been great talking to you, Mark. It's
pleasure.
I really regretted not being able to see you last year when you had the COVID, so I'm glad it worked out this year.
Well, I didn't die, so it's good.
Yeah, that's all good. And I'm sure we'll talk again down the road. But
absolutely,
best of luck with the book. That's the thing I'm really looking forward to next.
Well, thank you. I'm excited for it.
Okay, talk to you later.
Take care. Bye.
I realize I didn't introduce Mark before playing the interview, but as he has 96 design credits on BGG and is generally considered the dean of wargaming, you'll forgive me if I assumed you know who he is. Based on that chat, I bet I could interview Mark 6 more times and not get the same story twice. It was great to finally meet him and a delight to speak with him. All right. Parting shots. R.I.P. Alan Emmerich. Alan had a varied career in our hobby, working as a designer, developer, publisher, even artist. And he was also successful in the world of computer games. In terms of design, he'll be remembered for being co-designer of Totaler Krieg and then Axis Empires, but in our hobby, he'll be mostly remembered as the founder of Victory Point Games. They created an interesting niche for themselves. The games were larger than micro games like Ogre or Car Wars, but smaller than the typical GMT or Compass game. There was a strict limit on the number of counters a designer could use and the size of the map. They were also, I suppose they were a bit smaller than the average game. They also used Columbia Games' method of packaging the game in a generic pizza box with a game-specific sleeve, though said box was about half the size of a Columbia box. I'm sure that helped keep prices down. And they were one of the first companies to use laser cutting for their counters, which produced sharply cut pieces, but left a bit of detritus in the box that drove some gamers crazy. I never saw it myself, but I understand they took to including a napkin or towelette in each box so players could wipe down the pieces before using them. Victory Point published many notable designs, including the original versions of Carl Paradis' No Retreat series, Joe Miranda's Waterloo 20, and probably the most well-loved of all the State of Siege games, Steve Carey's We Must Tell the Emperor. It's a tribute to the quality of the games he published that so many of those games found new homes after the company folded. So farewell to Alan Emmerich. We're grateful for all you did to our hobby. Finally, thanks as always to all the Pushing Cardboard supporters, whether it's by becoming a Ko-Fi patron or buying swag. It helps pay all those hosting and streaming bills. And thanks as well to everyone who takes the time to stop by the website or the Discord. It's great talking to you. If you'd like to receive the newsletter and you don't yet, you can easily sign up at the website. There's one just for the podcast, which contains links to some of the things discussed in each episode, and another if you want to be notified of any special events. That one gets used much less often, but I totally recommend it. So that's it. Until next time, watch your six.